The metal chair creaked under Commander Zekthara's weight as he shifted nervously. His forearms were bound with energy shackles that glowed soft blue in the dim light of the interrogation room. The Vorthan warrior's once proud military uniform was now torn and stained, showing clear signs of the brutal battles he had survived. Across from him sat Velinara, a reporter from the Galactic News Network. She was a Kellerian, one of the few neutral species that both the Vorthan Empire and the human territories trusted to conduct fair interviews. Her silver skin reflected the harsh lights overhead as she adjusted her recording equipment. "Are you ready to begin, Commander?" Velinara asked in Standard Galactic. Her voice was calm and professional, but Zekthara could see the curiosity burning in her large black eyes. Zekthara's mandibles clicked together, a nervous habit he had developed since his capture 3 cycles ago. "I suppose I am," he replied, his voice rough from months of silence. "Though I still do not understand why anyone would want to hear this story." "The galaxy wants to know what happened," Velinara said gently. "Your empire was the strongest military force in known space. You had conquered 47 worlds without a single major defeat. Then you met the humans." The mention of humans made Zekthara's shoulders tense. His clawed hands clenched into fists despite the energy restraints. "The humans," he repeated, the words coming out like a curse. "Yes, I suppose that is why we are here." Velinara activated her recording devices. Red lights blinked to life around the room, capturing both video and audio from multiple angles. "Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about your first knowledge of humanity." Zekthara leaned back in his chair, his eyes growing distant as he remembered. "It was during the expansion into Sector 7. Our scouts had mapped several new star systems looking for suitable worlds to add to the Empire. Most were empty or held only primitive life forms. But then we found Sol." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The initial reports were routine, a single star with multiple planets. The third planet showed signs of intelligent life, but the readings were unimpressive. A young species, barely capable of space travel. They had sent a few small vessels to their moon and to some nearby planets, but nothing that suggested real spacefaring capability." Velinara nodded, making notes on her datapad. "What did your intelligence division conclude?" "Class 3 threat. Level," Zekthara said with a bitter laugh. "The lowest classification we give to any species with technology. Our analysts estimated we could conquer their entire system with a single battle group, maybe 2 if we wanted to be careful." The Vorthan commander's expression grew darker. "We had conquered species far more advanced than these humans appeared to be. The Karathi had energy weapons that could melt through our ship hulls. The Bremere had shield technology that took us months to overcome. But the humans? Their most powerful weapons seemed to be simple kinetic projectiles. Metal slugs fired from chemical explosives." "So the High Command approved the invasion?" Velinara prompted. "Approved it?" Zekthara's mandibles spread in what might have been a smile on a more pleasant face. High Commander Vekmer was excited about it. He saw it as a training exercise for our newer officers. A chance to give them combat experience against a real enemy without any serious risk. Zekthara stood up slowly, his restraints allowing him limited movement around the small room. The humans had no interstellar empire. No colonies beyond their own star system. Their ships were slow and clumsy looking. Their communications were primitive radio waves that we could intercept and decode easily. He moved to the small window that looked out into space. Through the transparent metal, he could see the lights of the neutral station Epsilon Prime, where dozens of species conducted trade and diplomacy in peace. "We thought they would be like the Yelthari from Sector 4. Remember them?" Velinara checked her notes. "The Yelthari surrendered after you destroyed 3 of their cities from orbit." "Exactly. Standard conquest protocol." demonstrate overwhelming force, demand surrender, accept their submission, and integrate them into the Empire. Clean, simple, efficient. Zekthara turned back to face the reporter. The Yelthari were warriors, but they understood when they were beaten. They valued their lives and their families more than hopeless resistance. But the humans were different? Zekthara was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Everything about them was different. But we did not know that when we began. He returned to his chair, settling his large frame carefully. The first assault fleet was assembled at Korthak Base, 12 heavy cruisers, 36 destroyers, and over 200 fighter craft, plus support vessels and troop transports, carrying 50,000 warriors. It was more than enough to conquer a dozen primitive worlds. You were part of this fleet? I commanded the 3rd battle group aboard the dreadnought Void Render. It was my first major command, a reward for my service in the Pelin campaigns. There was pride in his voice, quickly replaced by something darker. I was excited. My warriors were excited. We were going to add another victory to the Empire's glorious history. Velinara leaned forward. When did you first realize something was wrong? Zekthara's eyes grew distant again. The journey to Sol took 18 days through hyperspace. During that time, our intelligence continued to monitor human communications. They seemed to be going about their normal lives. No military preparations that we could detect. No calls for allies or attempts to evacuate their worlds. He paused, his claws drumming against the metal table. There were some odd things in their transmissions, but nothing that seemed important at the time. They had something they called movies that often showed their species fighting against invaders from space. We thought it was amusing that they fantasized about such things. They were entertainment programs. So we believed. Stories where their primitive warriors would defeat advanced alien civilizations through cleverness and determination. Our analysts laughed about it. They said it showed how naive and optimistic the humans were about their chances against a real spacefaring military. Zekthara's expression grew grim. We also intercepted their news broadcasts. They spoke often about conflicts between different groups of humans on their world. Small wars, political disputes, economic problems. It made them seem divided and weak, perfect targets for conquest. What about their military capabilities? Limited, Zekthara said firmly. They had nuclear weapons, but primitive ones that required large delivery systems. Their space vessels were clearly civilian designs with minimal armament. Most of their military seemed designed for fighting other humans on their planet's surface, not for space combat. The Vorthan commander stood again, pacing in the small space his restraints allowed. The humans did have one thing that impressed. Our strategists. They had spread throughout their star system remarkably quickly for such a young species. Mining operations in asteroid belts, research stations around gas giants, even small colonies on several moons. But you saw this as an advantage for your forces? Of course. Scattered targets are easier to defeat than concentrated ones. We could conquer their outer settlements first, then use them as bases to attack their home world. Standard island hopping. Tactics that had worked in dozens of previous campaigns. Zekthara stopped pacing and looked directly at Velinara. Everything we saw told us the same story. The humans were a young, weak, divided species that had expanded too quickly for their own good. They would be easy prey for the Empire's disciplined military machine. So you felt confident as you approached their territory? Confident? Zekthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. I was already planning how to spend my share of the conquest rewards. Promotion to High Commander seemed certain. Perhaps even a governorship of one of their worlds after we pacified it. He sat back down heavily. The night before we dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of their system, I recorded a message to my spawn mate back on Vorthik Prime. I told her the war would be over quickly. that the humans would probably surrender as soon as they saw our fleet. I promised to bring her back souvenirs from their primitive civilization. Velinara waited as Zekthara fell silent, staring at his bound hands. But that's not what happened. No, the commander said quietly. That is not what happened at all. When we arrived in the Sol system, we thought we were beginning another routine conquest. Instead, we had walked into the most carefully prepared trap in galactic history, and the humans were waiting for us. Zekthara's claws scraped against the metal table as he continued his story. The sound echoed in the quiet room, mixing with the soft hum of the recording equipment. Velinara waited patiently as the Vorthan commander gathered his thoughts. The first sign that something was wrong came when we dropped out of hyperspace near the outer edge of their system. Zekthara began. Our long-range sensors immediately began scanning for targets. We expected to find a few small research stations, and maybe some mining ships. Easy targets to establish our superiority. He paused, his four eyes blinking in sequence. Instead, we found nothing. The outer planets were completely empty. No ships, no stations, no signs of activity at all. It was as if the humans had simply vanished from half of their own star system. Velinara made a note on her pad. What did your commanders think of this? Fleet Commander Mordak was annoyed but not concerned. He assumed the humans had detected our approach and pulled back their forces to defend their inner worlds. It made tactical sense. Concentrate your limited resources where they could do the most good. Zekthara stood and walked to the window again. We advanced slowly, expecting to encounter their defensive perimeter somewhere around the gas giant they called Jupiter. Our battle formation was perfect. Scouts ahead, main battle line in the center, support vessels protected in the rear. We had done this same approach hundreds of times before. When did you first encounter human forces? 3 days into the system. Zekthara's voice grew quieter. Our advanced scouts were investigating the moons around Jupiter when they stopped reporting. At first, we thought it was just communication problems. Space combat can interfere with transmission signals. He turned back to face Velinara. But when the second scout group also went silent, Commander Mordak ordered the third battle group to investigate. My battle group. Zekthara returned to his chair, his movements slower now. I took 6 destroyers and 2 heavy cruisers toward Jupiter's largest moon. Our sensors showed no enemy contacts, no weapon signatures, nothing that suggested danger. But our scouts were definitely gone. What did you find? Debris. Lots of debris floating in space near one of the smaller moons. Metal fragments that had once been Vorthan ships, but scattered across thousands of kilometers. It looked like our scouts had been completely destroyed, but we could not determine what had killed them. Zekthara's mandibles clicked nervously. The strange thing was that there were no burn marks on the debris, no signs of energy weapon damage or explosive residue. The ships looked like they had been crushed rather than blown apart. Velinara leaned forward with interest. Crushed. Exactly. As if some enormous force had simply squeezed them until they broke apart. We had never seen anything like it. Our weapons experts were completely puzzled. The Vorthan commander's expression grew darker. While we were examining the debris, our sensor officer detected movement near Europa, another of Jupiter's moons. Small ships, maybe 8 or 10 vessels, approaching our position at high speed. Human ships? They appeared to be cargo vessels. Slow, clumsy-looking craft that our database identified as civilian freighters. The kind of ships used to transport goods between planets. Nothing that should pose any threat to military vessels. Zekthara. 4 hands clenched into fists. Commander Mordak ordered us to capture one of them for interrogation. Standard procedure when dealing with primitive species. We needed information about their military capabilities and leadership. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong. Zekthara's voice was barely above a whisper now. As soon as we moved to intercept the lead freighter, all 10 ships suddenly changed course and formation. They moved like military vessels, with precision and coordination that should have been impossible for civilian crews. He stood again, beginning to pace within his restraints. Then they opened fire. These cargo ships that were supposed to be defenseless unleashed weapon arrays that had been completely hidden from our sensors. Energy cannons, missile launchers, even some kind of particle beam weapons we had never encountered before. The humans had disguised warships as cargo vessels. That was what we thought at first, but it was worse than that. Zekthara stopped pacing and stared at the floor. We captured communication signals from the human ships during the battle. The crews were talking to each other, and they were not military personnel. Velinara looked confused. What do you mean? They were actually cargo ship crews. Civilian pilots, engineers, mechanics. People whose job was supposed to be moving freight between planets. But they were fighting like experienced warriors. Zekthara's voice grew stronger as he continued. The lead ship was commanded by someone called Jake Morrison. During the battle, he was giving orders to his crew and talking to the other ships. But he was also explaining what he was doing, like he was teaching a class. Teaching? Morrison would say things like, "Remember to angle your shields at 30 degrees to deflect particle beams," or "Wait until they get within 5,000 kilometers before launching missiles." He was conducting a space battle while simultaneously training other civilian crews how to fight. The Vorthan commander sat back down heavily. We destroyed 3 of the human ships in that first engagement, but Morrison's vessel and 4 others managed to escape. As they retreated, Morrison sent a transmission on an open channel that all our ships could hear. What did he say? Zekthara was quiet for a moment, then spoke in careful Standard Galactic. He said, "Welcome to Sol System, Vorthan Empire. We hope you enjoy your stay. It will be much shorter than you expect." Velinara made rapid notes. That sounds like psychological warfare. It was, but not in any way we had encountered before. Morrison was not trying to intimidate us or make us afraid. He sounded friendly, like he was genuinely welcoming guests to his home. Zekthara's mandibles spread in what might have been a confused expression. But then he added something that made no sense at the time, which was, he said, "Oh, and thank you for the target practice. The mining crews at Ceres have been getting bored." Then he signed off by playing what our translators identified as human music. Something called "Born in the USA." Zekthara began pacing again. The next 18 hours were like nothing in our military experience. We advanced toward the inner system, expecting to encounter more organized resistance. Instead, we found ourselves under constant attack by ships that should not have existed. More disguised freighters, mining vessels, research ships, even what appeared to be passenger transports. All of them armed with military-grade weapons, all of them crewed by civilians who fought like veterans. Zekthara's voice was filled with bewilderment. We would detect what looked like a helpless science vessel, move to capture it, and suddenly find ourselves fighting a mobile weapons platform. How were your forces responding? With confusion and growing frustration. We were winning individual battles, but every victory cost us more than it should have. And the humans never fought the way military doctrine said they should. Zekthara stopped pacing and looked directly at Velinara. Normal civilized warfare has rules. When a ship is critically damaged, it surrenders or retreats. When facing overwhelming odds, commanders negotiate for the lives of their crews. When defeat is certain, rational beings choose survival over pointless sacrifice. But not the humans? The humans seemed to view death as preferable to defeat. Ships that were burning and powerless would ram our vessels rather than surrender. Crews that were trapped would detonate their own reactors to take our boarding parties with them. The Vorthan commander's voice grew distant. There was one engagement near a moon called Ganymede. A human mining ship called the Lucky Strike was surrounded by 4 of our destroyers. The ship was heavily damaged, its weapons offline, its engines failing. Did they surrender? The captain, a woman named Lisa Murphy, opened a communication channel to our fleet commander. We expected her to negotiate terms for her crew's survival. Instead, she thanked us for giving her the chance to test her ship's new ramming modifications. Zekthara sat down heavily. Murphy had converted her mining ship into a weapon specifically designed to ram enemy vessels. She accelerated directly at our flagship while broadcasting human poetry about sacrifice and honor. Her ship destroyed itself and crippled our heavy cruiser Dominator. That sounds like suicide tactics. It was suicide, but Morrison and his people called it something else. They called it making the enemy pay the price. Every human ship we destroyed took at least one of ours with it. Sometimes more. Zekthara was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice was shaky. The worst part was not there. Willingness to die. The worst part was that they seemed to be enjoying themselves. During battles, we would intercept their communications, and they would be laughing, telling jokes, even singing songs. They were entertained by combat. Morrison's people treated warfare like it was some kind of competitive sport. They would congratulate each other on good shots, celebrate successful maneuvers, and comment our tactics like they were watching the game. Zekthara's 4 eyes blinked rapidly. And they kept learning. Every battle, their coordination improved. Their tactics became more sophisticated. Their aim became more accurate. Zekthara's breathing had become labored as he continued his account. The stress of remembering the Earth campaign was clearly taking its toll on the once proud warrior. He gripped the edges of his chair with all 4 hands, his knuckles showing white through his gray skin. The orbital bombardment of Earth was supposed to be simple, he began, his voice hoarse. Standard procedure called for destroying their military installations and major population centers from space. Force them to surrender before we even had to land troops. Velinara adjusted her recording equipment as she noticed Zekthara's distress. But your bombardment was not effective? We could not find targets. Zekthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. Our sensors detected no military bases, no weapons facilities, no obvious command centers. Earth appeared to be covered with civilian cities, farms, and industrial areas. Nothing that looked like military infrastructure. He stood up and began his nervous pacing again. Fleet Commander Mordak was frustrated. He ordered deeper scans, looking for hidden bunkers or underground facilities. What we found made no sense. What do you mean? Every human building seemed to serve multiple purposes. Schools had been modified with communication equipment. Hospitals contained what looked like command centers. Even shopping centers appeared to have weapon storage areas. Zekthara shook his head. It was like their entire civilization had been converted into a military base, but done so carefully that it still looked civilian. Velinara made notes quickly. So you decided to land ground forces? Commander Mordak felt we had no choice. He selected 3 major population centers for simultaneous assault. One was called New York, another was Denver, and the third was a place called Houston. The plan was to capture these cities quickly and use them as bases to control the rest of the planet. Zekthara returned to his chair, his movements showing exhaustion. I was assigned to lead the assault on Denver. Intelligence reports indicated it was a minor city with limited strategic value. Perfect for a training exercise for my younger officers. How many troops did you have? 12,000 warriors in the first wave, with support vehicles and air cover. More than enough to capture a primitive human city. Zekthara's expression grew dark. The dropships landed in a large open area near the city center. Everything looked normal from above. Buildings, roads, vehicles moving around, just like any other populated area we had conquered before. But something was different when you landed. The silence. Zekthar's voice dropped to a whisper. When we landed, the city was completely quiet. No civilians running in panic, no military forces rushing to defend, no signs of resistance at all, just empty streets and closed buildings. He paused, gathering his thoughts. My advance teams moved toward the city center, expecting to encounter scattered resistance. Instead, they found something much worse. The humans had turned their entire city into a fortress. Velinara leaned forward. With interest. How so? Every building had been prepared for siege warfare. Windows were reinforced with metal barriers. Rooftops had been converted into firing positions. Underground tunnels connected different structures, allowing defenders to move without being seen. Zekthara stood again, his agitation growing. But the most disturbing thing was the civilians. They had not evacuated. Families were still living in their homes. Children were attending classes in schools. People were working in offices. They were going about their normal lives while preparing for war. They used civilians as shields? No, that was not it at all. Zekthora's mandibles spread in confusion. The civilians were the soldiers. When our forces entered the first residential area, they came under fire from ordinary houses. The weapons were being operated by people who should have been non-combatants. You mean the humans armed their civilian population? More than that, they had trained them. Zekthara began pacing again. A grandmother would be tending her garden in the morning, then operating an anti-aircraft gun in the afternoon. Children would play games in the street, then serve as messengers for military units. Office workers would spend their day at desk jobs, then conduct night raids against our positions. Velinara looked puzzled. How could civilians be effective against trained warriors? Because they knew every building, every street, every hiding place in their city. They had spent months preparing positions and supply routes. Most importantly, they were defending their homes and families. Zekthora's voice carried a note of respect. A parent fighting to protect their children is more dangerous than any professional soldier. What about their military leadership? That was the most confusing part. The human commander was a woman named Colonel Lisa Parker. According to our intelligence, she had been a logistics officer before the war began. Her job was managing supply chains and transportation schedules. Zekthara sat back down, his four hands rubbing his temples. Parker had somehow organized the entire civilian population of Denver into an incredibly effective fighting force. She had turned grocery stores into ammunition depots, subway tunnels into supply routes, and office buildings into command centers. How long did the battle for Denver last? 18 days. Zekthara's voice was filled with exhaustion. 18 days of fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We would clear a building in the morning, find it reoccupied by evening. We would establish a secure perimeter, only to discover that the humans had tunneled underneath it during the night. What made the fighting so difficult? The humans refused to follow any rules of warfare. They would use their own wounded as bait to lure our medics into ambushes. They booby-trapped their dead with explosives. They showed no regard for the safety of their own non-combatants. Zekthara's voice grew angry. But the worst part was their psychological warfare. They would capture our wounded and treat them with excellent medical care, then release them with messages for our commanders. They wanted us to know that they were better people than we were, even while they were killing us. They released captured soldiers, not just released them. They would send our wounded back with care packages containing food, medicine, and handwritten letters from human civilians. The letters would explain why humanity would never surrender, but they were written in a friendly, almost apologetic tone. Zekthora stood and walked to the window, staring out at the stars. I remember one letter that was given to a wounded communications officer from my unit. A human child, maybe 10 years old, had written it. She apologized for shooting at our soldiers, but explained that she was protecting her baby brother. She included a drawing of her family and asked our soldier to show it to his own children when he got home. That must have been disturbing for your troops. It was devastating. How do you fight an enemy who treats you better than your own commanders do, while simultaneously trying to kill you? Zekhora's reflection was visible in the window, showing his tortured expression. The humans would broadcast personal messages from our captured soldiers to their families back on Vorthik Prime, not to demoralize the families, but to prove that prisoners were being treated well. Meanwhile, they continued fighting. They escalated their resistance every day. Parker had organized the civilian population into specialized teams. Children served as scouts and messengers because they could move through small spaces adults could not access. Elderly humans operated communication networks because they had the patience for detailed coordination work. Parents conducted the most dangerous missions because they had the strongest motivation to succeed. Zekthara turned back to face Velinara. The humans had turned their entire society into a military machine, but they had done it while maintaining their civilian lives. Schools continued to operate, but the lessons included military tactics. Hospitals treated wounded, but they also served as intelligence centers. Families continued to eat dinner together, but they discussed battle plans over their meals. How did your forces respond to this kind of resistance? With growing desperation and confusion. My warriors were trained to fight other military forces, not an entire population that had become combatants. Every building we entered could contain enemies. Every civilian we encountered might be a fighter. Every act of kindness might be part of a trap. Zekthar's voice grew quieter. By the 10th day of fighting, my soldiers were showing signs of severe stress. They could not understand an enemy that would share food with them in the morning and try to kill them in the afternoon. Several of my officers requested transfers to other units, claiming they could not fight children and grandparents. But the humans continued to resist. They did more than resist. They thrived on the fighting. Parker had created a rotation system where civilians would spend part of their time on normal activities and part of their time on military duties. This kept them mentally healthy while maintaining constant pressure on our forces. What was the turning point in the battle? Day 15. We had finally managed to corner Parker and her command staff in what had been a shopping center. The building was surrounded, all escape routes were blocked, and we had overwhelming firepower advantage. Victory seemed certain. Zekthar's mandibles clicked nervously. Instead of surrendering, Parker activated what she called the Neighborhood Watch Protocol. Zekthar's hands trembled as he reached for a cup of water that Velinara had provided. The liquid sloshed slightly as he lifted it to his lips, a sign of how deeply the memories affected him. When he set the cup down, his 4 eyes were focused on something far beyond the walls of the interview room. The counterattack began on day 19, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We had just received orders from Fleet Commander Mordek to retreat to orbital positions and regroup. Our ground forces had taken massive casualties in all 3 cities, and morale was at the lowest point in Vorthan military history. Velinara waited patiently as Zekthara gathered his thoughts. She could see that this part of the story was the most difficult for him to tell. The first sign that something had changed came from our long-range sensors. Ships were approaching from the outer system, but they were not coming from the direction we expected. These vessels were arriving from deep space, from areas where our initial scans had detected nothing. More hidden human forces? These were not hidden. They were ships we had seen before, but we had dismissed them as unimportant. Mining platforms, research stations, colony ships that were decades old. Our intelligence had classified them as civilian infrastructure, not military assets. Zekthara stood and began his familiar pacing. What we discovered was that the humans had been preparing for invasion for years. Every civilian installation in their system had been secretly converted into a potential weapon. Mining platforms became mobile weapons platforms. Research stations became spy posts and communication hubs. Colony ships became troop transports and mobile bases. How many ships were there? Over 300 vessels of various sizes. Some were as large as our heavy cruisers, others were smaller than our fighters. But all of them were armed, and all of them were crewed by people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Zekthara's voice grew stronger as he continued. The human fleet was led by Admiral Susan Hayes aboard a converted colony ship called the New Horizon. Hayes had been preparing for this moment for more than 20 years. She had convinced the human government to secretly militarize every space-based installation in their system. What made their fleet so effective? Coordination and surprise. While we had been fighting on Earth's surface, Hayes had been positioning her ships around our fleet like pieces on a game board. When the attack began, we found ourselves surrounded by enemies we had not even known existed. Zekthara returned to his chair, his movements showing the weight of defeat. The New Horizon itself was a perfect example of human deception. Our sensors showed it as a peaceful colony ship, built to transport families to new worlds. What we did not know was that Hayes had spent 15 years converting it into a mobile command center with weapons that could destroy our largest ships. What kind of weapons? Technology that should not have existed. The humans had been secretly developing weapon systems while pretending to be a peaceful species interested only in exploration and trade. Zekthara's mandibles clicked in remembered confusion. They had energy weapons more powerful than ours. Defensive shields we could not penetrate, and most disturbing of all, weapons that used principles of physics we did not understand. Velinara leaned forward with interest. Can you give me an example? There was a human research vessel called the Endeavor. According to our intelligence, it was studying gravitational anomalies around black holes. Dr. Alex Turner was the chief scientist aboard that ship. We assumed he was conducting harmless research into space phenomena. Zekthora's 4 hands clenched into fists. Turner had weaponized gravitational manipulation technology. During the battle, we watched as 3 of our heaviest dreadnoughts were crushed like insects by artificial gravity wells. Ships that had conquered dozens of worlds were simply squeezed until their hulls collapsed. The humans had gravity weapons? Turner treated the destruction of our fleet like a university lecture. While his weapons were killing thousands of Vorthan warriors, he was broadcasting detailed explanations of how the technology worked. He spoke as if he was teaching a class about physics while simultaneously demonstrating the most terrifying weapons we had ever encountered. Zekthara stood again and walked to the window. The worst part was his attitude. Turner was not angry or hateful. He seemed genuinely excited to show off human scientific achievements. He would say things like, "Notice how the gravitational field increases exponentially as it approaches the target while our ships were being destroyed." What was the human strategy during this counterattack? Complete annihilation combined with education. They were not just defeating our fleet. They were systematically demonstrating their technological superiority while explaining how they had achieved it. Zekthora's reflection in the window showed his haunted expression. Admiral Hayes broadcast continuous updates about their weapons and tactics, as if she wanted the entire galaxy to learn from our defeat. Did your forces try to fight back? We tried everything. Concentrated fire on single targets, coordinated attacks by entire battle groups, even ramming attacks when our weapons proved ineffective. Nothing worked. The humans had developed countermeasures for every tactic in our military doctrine. Zekthara turned back to Velinara. But the most demoralizing aspect of the battle was not their superior technology. It was their attitude. The human crews were treating the destruction of our invasion force like a celebration. They would cheer when they destroyed our ships, congratulate each other on successful attacks, and play music during combat. They were enjoying the fighting, More than that, they were having fun. We would intercept their communications and hear laughter, jokes, even singing. One human pilot destroyed 2 of our fighters while performing some kind of acrobatic maneuver, then broadcast a message saying, "Did you guys see that? I have been practicing that move for months." Zekthara's voice grew bitter. The humans fought. Like combat was a form of entertainment. They would try elaborate tactics just to see if they would work. They would take unnecessary risks to achieve more spectacular victories. They turned warfare into a competitive sport where the goal was not just to win, but to win in the most impressive way possible. How long did the space battle last? 6 hours. In 6 hours, the human fleet destroyed or disabled 70% of our invasion force. Ships that had served the Empire for decades were reduced to scrap metal by civilians who had learned warfare as a hobby. Zekthara sat down heavily. The turning point came when Dr. Turner and Admiral Hayes coordinated an attack on our command ship. Turner created a gravity well that held the Void Render in position, while Hayes led a squadron of converted passenger ships in a precision assault on our weapon systems. "What happened to your command ship?" "It was captured intact." Hayes wanted to study our technology, but more importantly, she wanted to send a message to the Empire. She broadcast a transmission to Vorthek Prime showing human engineers examining our most advanced weapon systems and explaining their weaknesses to anyone who was listening. Zekthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. Hayes treated our defeat like a science experiment. She documented everything, analyzed our tactics, and published her findings for other species to study. She wanted the entire galaxy to know exactly how the humans had defeated the Vorthan Empire. What was the message she sent to your homeworld? Hayes spoke directly to the Vorthan High Command. She thanked them for providing humanity with an excellent opportunity to test their defensive systems. She explained that the invasion had helped human military planners identify areas where their preparations needed improvement. Zekthara's voice dropped to a whisper. Then she offered to share human defensive technology with any species that was interested in protecting themselves from future Vorthan aggression. She was turning our defeat into a recruiting tool for an anti-Empire alliance. How did the battle end? With an ultimatum that was not really an ultimatum. Hayes contacted Fleet Commander Mordek and politely asked if he would like to surrender the remainder of his fleet. She explained that the humans had no desire to kill more Vorthan warriors unnecessarily, but they were prepared to continue the demonstration if required. Zekthara stood and began pacing again. Morgok asked what terms the humans would offer for surrender. Hayes said there were no terms. She just wanted the killing to stop. Any Vorthan warriors who surrendered would be treated well and eventually return to Empire space with full knowledge of human capabilities. That sounds almost generous. It was the most devastating psychological blow of the entire war. Hayes was not demanding tribute or territory or political concessions. She was offering to let us go home with the humiliating knowledge that we had been completely outmatched by a species we had thought was primitive. Zekthara stopped pacing and looked directly at Velinara. The humans were not interested in conquering the Vorthan Empire. They just wanted us to understand that we could never conquer them. They wanted every species in the galaxy to know that humanity was not prey. What was your personal experience during the surrender? Relief and terror in equal measure. Relief that the killing had stopped, but terror at what we had discovered about humanity. We had encountered a species that was more advanced than us, better organized than us. Zekthara sat in complete silence for several minutes, staring at his bound hands. The weight of what he was about to reveal seemed to press down on him like a physical force. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Velinara had to lean forward to hear him. The worst part of the entire war was not the fighting or the dying or even the defeat, he began slowly. The worst part was learning the truth about what had really happened, about how long the humans had been planning for our arrival. Velinara waited patiently as Zekthara gathered the strength to continue his story. She could see that this final revelation was the most difficult part for him to share. 3 days after our surrender, Admiral Hayes invited the surviving Vorthan officers to attend what she called a debriefing session. We thought it would be a standard prisoner interrogation. Instead, Hayes showed us something that changed everything we thought we knew about the war. What did she show you? Archives. Massive databases of information that the humans had collected about the Vorthan Empire over the past 15 years. They had detailed records of our military structure, our weapons technology, our conquest strategies, even personal files on individual officers like myself. Zektharis' mandibles clicked nervously. Hayes explained that human deep space monitoring stations had detected our scout ships, entering their territory years before we launched the invasion. Not only had they detected us, they had intercepted and decoded all of our communications. The humans knew you were coming. They knew everything. Our battle plans, our force composition, our target selection, even our timeline for the invasion. The humans had been reading our military communications for years, while we thought we were conducting secret reconnaissance. Zekthara stood, began pacing, his agitation growing. But that was not the most shocking revelation. Hayes showed us records of human government meetings dating back over a decade. They had been discussing how to respond to our eventual invasion since the day their sensors first detected Vorthan ships in their outer system. What kind of discussions? Strategic planning sessions where human leaders debated different options for dealing with our threat. Some wanted to send diplomatic messages and try to avoid conflict. Others wanted to build up military forces and prepare for conventional warfare. Zekthara's voice grew darker. But the option they chose was the most terrifying of all. They decided to appear weak and vulnerable while secretly preparing for total war. They wanted us to invade so they could demonstrate their true capabilities to the entire galaxy. Velinara looked confused. They wanted to be invaded? General Amy Rodriguez was the architect of the entire deception. She had studied Vorthan military history and realized that our empire only attacked species we believed we could easily defeat. So she convinced the human government to deliberately appear primitive and defenseless. Zekthara sat back down heavily. Rodriguez spent 12 years orchestrating the greatest military deception in galactic history. Every aspect of human society that we observed was carefully crafted to make them seem like easy targets. Can you give me examples? Their spaceships were designed to look clumsy and inefficient while actually being highly advanced vessels. Their military forces were kept hidden while civilian populations were trained in secret. Their technology was disguised to appear primitive while they developed weapons that surpassed anything in our arsenal. Zekthora's 4 hands clenched into fists. Even their entertainment broadcasts were part of the deception. Those movies about humans fighting alien invaders were not just stories. They were training materials disguised as entertainment, teaching their population how to resist conquest while making us think they were naive dreamers. How extensive was this deception? Every human we encountered during the war was playing a role that had been planned years in advance. Jake Morrison was not just a freighter captain who happened to be brave. He was a former military officer who had spent 5 years training civilian crews to fight like veterans while appearing to be ordinary cargo haulers. Zekthara's voice grew more agitated. Colonel Lisa Parker was not a logistics officer who improvised the defense of Denver. She was a specialist in urban warfare who had spent 3 years converting that city into a fortress while maintaining the appearance of normal civilian life. What about Dr. Turner and his gravity weapons? Turner had been developing those weapons for 8 years, but the humans made sure our intelligence reports described him as a harmless scientist studying space phenomena. They wanted us to dismiss him as a non-threat until the moment his weapons destroyed our fleet. Zekthara stood and walked to the window again. Admiral Hayes showed us communication records, proving that every human we had fought knew exactly what role they were supposed to play in the overall deception. The entire war had been choreographed like a performance, with each act designed to reveal different aspects of human capabilities. That sounds impossible to coordinate. Rodriguez had organized the most complex military operation in known history. Millions of humans had been trained to play specific roles while maintaining complete operational security. Not one person broke character during the entire deception. Zektharos' reflection in the window showed his defeated expression. The humans had been so committed to appearing weak that they deliberately handicapped themselves during the early stages of fighting. Morrison's crews could have destroyed our advance forces immediately, but they held back to make the battles look more convincing. Why would they limit their own effectiveness? Because they wanted other species to witness what appeared to be a desperate struggle followed by an impossible victory. They were sending a message to every potential aggressor in the galaxy that humanity was not what it appeared to be. Zekthara turned back to Velinara. Hayes explained that the entire war had been broadcast to dozens of different civilizations. Species that might have considered attacking Earth in the future had watched our complete defeat and learned that humans were far more dangerous than they seemed. What was the strategic purpose of this deception? Rodriguez had realized that the best defense was not just to defeat potential invaders, but to prevent them from attacking in the first place. By demonstrating overwhelming superiority while appearing to be peaceful civilians, humanity had established itself as a species that no rational empire would choose to fight. Zektharos' voice became bitter. We were not the target of their demonstration. We were the demonstration itself. Our invasion, our defeat, our humiliation, all of it was designed to serve as a warning to other aggressive species. What was the most shocking part of the revelation? The contingency plans. Hayes showed us archives detailing what would have happened if their deception had failed and we had somehow achieved victory on Earth. Zekthara sat down and put his head in his hands. The humans had been prepared to completely sterilize their own planet rather than allow it to be conquered. They had hidden nuclear weapons, biological agents, and something called scorched earth protocols that would have made Earth uninhabitable for any occupying force. They would have destroyed their own world. Rodriguez had convinced the entire human species that death was preferable to conquest. Every major population center had hidden self-destruction systems that could be activated by any surviving government official. The humans would have turned Earth into a dead rock rather than let us rule it. Zekthara looked up with haunted eyes. But even that was not the most disturbing part of their planning. Hayes showed us evidence that human colonies beyond Earth had been prepared to continue fighting even if their homeworld was destroyed. The war would have continued for generations, with human survivors conducting endless guerrilla campaigns against any Vorthan occupation forces. They were prepared for a war of extinction, total species commitment to resistance. Every human, from children to elderly, had been psychologically prepared to sacrifice their lives rather than accept defeat. It was not just military planning. It was cultural conditioning on a scale that defied understanding. Zekthara stood and faced the camera directly, speaking not just to Velinara, but to anyone who might view the recording. I am telling this story because other species need to understand what humanity really is. They are not the peaceful explorers they pretend to be. They are apex predators who have learned to disguise themselves as prey. His voice grew stronger as he continued. The humans defeated the Vorthan Empire without revealing their true military capabilities. Everything we experienced was just a demonstration of their basic defensive systems. Hayes told us that we had seen less than 20% of their actual weapons technology. What message do you want to send to other potential aggressors? Do not make the mistake we made. Do not assume that humanity is weak because they appear peaceful. Do not believe that they are vulnerable because they seem isolated. And most importantly, do not think that you can defeat them because other species have told you it would be easy. Zekthara's 4 hands spread wide in a gesture of warning. The humans have spent their entire existence preparing for war while convincing everyone around them that they value peace. They are the most dangerous species in the galaxy, precisely because they do not appear dangerous until it is too late to retreat.